Okay then. I presume everybody can see my Word file, I guess, with Note 1 and Note 2 on it. So I also have a couple of caveats. One is I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a licensed financial expert. So anything that I say here, I'm going to be speaking as a landlord and a property owner and an investor, not in the capacity of a legal or financial licensed expert. Sorry, Robert's already explained my background a little bit. The one thing that he wouldn't know, which is on my note here, is that I also own 7 small apartment buildings. 5 of them are in Oshawa, one's in Brantford, one's in Peterborough, comprising 73 units, and I hands-on manage them myself. I don't have a property manager. And then the third point, just to protect Robert from anything that I might say, because I am, as he said, outspoken, and he may not always agree with everything that I say. That's the way of the world. So the views and opinions expressed here are mine alone. Okay. So to speak about the licensing program, in January of 2022, this year, the City of Oshawa made a 1-paragraph announcement on some press release that they put on their website, and somebody just happened to see it and send it to me. They didn't really tell anybody at our Landlord Association or any other landlord association that's been around for a while, like FRPO, which is the Federation of Rental Property Owners of Ontario. No one knew, so they blindsided us with this little announcement. And said that they wanted to roll out a licensing program to every landlord across the city for every type of property that can be rented. So anything from a condo and an apartment skyscraper to a second suite in somebody's home. In order to do this, they wanted to increase their staff from 28 to, well, add 33 staff. So what's that, 62? 61. So they wanted to literally double their staff, and they wanted us landlords to pay for it at a cost of about 4.98 million. I don't remember the exact number, but it's almost 5. And the issue that I saw as soon as I saw it was that cities, by their nature, municipalities by their nature, point to other municipalities for their success. They'll say this program is going to be successful because we found other cities that are doing the same thing, which means that if these guys rolled out this program and was able to get away with charging $5 million to landlords across the city, then you can be pretty sure that the other municipalities around the province, in fact, across the country, would embrace it and try and replicate that. So that was problem number 1. If you wait until the program is installed and running, you will never, ever be able to get it stopped. And you can look at hundreds of tax schemes, programs, licensing fees of all kinds that have gotten through. And once they've been instated, they can never be canceled. The program that they were proposing was to send out inspectors to every property to find out if they were compliant. And when I read that, for the first time in my 60+ years as a human being, I became radicalized. I'd never been an activist. I'd never, really questioned government before. I'm the same as most voters. You got to be kidding me. Government's kind of short-sighted and sometimes stupid. But I never really ever picked up the mantle and said, this is fundamentally wrong. But this time I did. And I wrote an article that got published in Real Estate Magazine that said, Oshawa proposes state-sanctioned surveillance with unaccountable bylaw officers. And they were very upset about that article. In fact, you can find it on Real Estate Magazine. If you go to REM, Real Estate Magazine, remonline.com, and then do a search for my last name, Seepe, and Oshawa. And you will see not only the article that I wrote, which I will readily admit I was very upset, and there are some statements that are inflammatory, but it was intentional. It wasn't by, just a rant. They then published an article as a rebuttal, and you'll be able to see that as well, and you'll be able to see the comments that people have written. So my big concern is if they did install this thing and they started to, surveil every one of us, it would be proactive instead of reactive. And as far as I'm concerned, that's one step away from a police state. And in fact, in the presentation, I did a 10-minute presentation as a delegation to the city council on April 4th. And they, one of the councilors asked me, do you really believe that what we're trying to do here is the same as the police state? And I said, without a doubt, unequivocally, yes. So this to me was just unconscionable. So I've been, since then, doing a number of things. One of the things I did was a petition. So I've got 583 supporters. There have been 6,500 people who have looked at it, and they've shared it with other social agencies 230 times. Social media, I should say, pardon me, 230 times. So yeah, so I've covered off these points. One of the big things that that none of the city officials really understood is that there's a direct relationship in investment properties between the income that a property generates, when you subtract that your operating expenses from that income, it leaves what's referred to as net operating income, or NOI. And if you increase the cost of your operating business by $5 million, and I did a little bit of math, I basically came out to a calculation that Oshawa would lose $110 million literally overnight if they institute this program. Not one single councillor asked me about that. And that gave me a lot of concern as well. They couldn't care less that they're wiping out. Well, by their silence, I just assumed they couldn't care less. And maybe that's not a fair statement, but they never asked the question, and they had plenty of time to do so. What that means basically is that if you've got a lower value in your property, the property taxes that they charge are based on the value of a property. We all know that because you have to do your MPAC filings every year. An MPAC tells you what the property is worth, and then the city applies a tax, or what they call a mill rate, MIL, which is so many dollars per $1,000 of value. So a 2.5 mill rate would be $2.50 for every $1,000 of value, and that's how you calculate your property tax. So having a low value would mean that they generate less income. And if they're generating less income and they still got the same infrastructure because they got fixed costs, only one of two things can happen. Either they're going to increase the property taxes, or they're going to have lower revenue. The third choice in this particular case they're just going to increase the fees. And we've seen that happen. The land transfer tax, for example, has increased 566% since it was introduced about 30 years ago. So it's gone up almost 600%. So what you've got here is a vicious circle of government interference in things that they don't fully understand. To try and solve a small problem, they create many more problems that they didn't anticipate. to their credit, they did ask for feedback, and they got it with 2 shotgun barrels last Monday. I think there were 10 speakers from all walks of life that spoke to the city councilors about why this would be a very bad thing. So some of the potential consequences, probably the #1 top of mind election issue that we're going to see in Ontario and in the federal government over the next couple of years is going to be housing, and particularly, everyone calls it affordable housing, but that is the wrong word to use, because as soon as you talk about affordable housing, nobody knows what you're talking about. You're talking about social housing, public housing, assisted living, rent geared to income, income to wage, and all that kind of stuff. So I prefer to call it the issue of unaffordable housing. And it's not about public housing. It's about whether or not you as an individual, regardless of what your income level is, can you afford to buy a home? And someone who's making $200,000 a year 5 years ago might have been able to buy $1 million home, and today they can't. That's unaffordable. On our side of the spectrum, we've now seen rents increase anywhere from 15 to 30%. Oshawa now has, let's see, 2 years ago, I was renting out a 1-bedroom for approximately $1,100 plus electricity, plus parking, plus water in this case. And today I'm doing $1,450, so $350 on $1,100 is a 30% increase. So it's becoming untenable, and it's and one of the great issues of unaffordability is adding cost. And if you're going to implement a program like this and try and collect $5 million from landlords, eventually it just gets passed on to the tenant. So any kind of fee, whether it's a vacancy tax or a foreign tax, investor tax, flipping tax, $1 million tax. I mean, these are all taxes that they're talking about today, and they've implemented a couple of them already. They all just add cost. Then the seller's going to say, well, that's just the cost of doing business. I'll just tack it on to whatever price I require when I sell a property or when I rent out a property. I'm just going to add that cost on. So who winds up paying? Either the renter or the buyer. So it's short-sighted and ill-informed. I'm trying to be as diplomatic as possible here because it's going to be a public presentation. Property bylaws define minimum property standards. What will happen if you implement a program like this is every landlord is going to say, okay, I'm no longer going to find my own comfort zone with respect to property standards. I'm just going to follow the minimum, which is exactly what happened with rent control. Instead of applying a rent, some people don't take any rent increase at all because they really like their tenants and they want to do well by them and so on. Now the government essentially says this is what you can increase the rent by, and most landlords take the maximum. So licensing fees discourage housing development. If you are looking to build a property in a particular area and there are all kinds of licensing fees, you're probably going to look elsewhere. If you want to invest in a particular area and there are strong licensing restrictions and demands that you meet standards, and you've got people looking over your shoulder and inspectors who are going to show up at your door and say, no, you cannot rent out your 12-unit property until you fix the screen door, you're going to say, well, that's not for me. I'm going to look elsewhere. And I can tell you that licenses have been held back because the grass is too tall or a screen window, which you can't replace because the building is 35 years old. And they're saying, you fix it or we're going to take away all of your income until you do. Most people don't realize that 49%, in fact, literally half of all the rental properties in Canada are in the hands of unincorporated individuals. literally half. And even the government doesn't know that. They always think, and the media thinks, and tenant advocates all think that the rental properties are mostly in the hands of big business, and it's simply not true. So if you anytime have questions, raise your hand. I can't see them, but Robert can step in and, interrupt me if you wish to do that, or you can wait until the end, your choice. Durham Region is larger than Toronto, although its population is smaller. In terms of total area, I think there are about 10 municipalities. The 10 least affluent groups in Durham Region are all in Oshawa. And we all know that low-income tenants live exclusively in rental properties. I don't think there's such a thing as a low-income homeowner. Maybe there is, but if there is, it would have to be pretty rare.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah.
We have a question from
Sure.
Vidal, and I know Vidal is actually a Durham area landlord.
Okay.
Hi, good evening. So I'll just clarify. We reside within Durham, but we don't actually own in Durham. Although I have actively shopped in Durham, and we did own in Peterborough, but all our stuff is centered in Quinte and Belleville. But I mean, the concerns would generally be the same. But I guess I'm all for weeding out bad landlords and unsafe premises for tenants. Like you sometimes go through certain areas where you're thinking, how is that place even inhabitable? I'm all for weeding out that kind of stuff. But as far as like hiring all these new bylaw officers to do proactive inspections, like what is it that they're actually concerned about? If there's aside from being on a complaint basis, are they concerned about overcrowding? Are they concerned about improper fire separation or things like?
You're ahead of my presentation.
Okay.
I will answer that question momentarily.
All right, sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't mean to cut you off. I'm just, I will answer your question.
Yep.
Okay, so what I wanted to get to is that the people in Ontario don't realize that tenants actually pay the property tax. It's built into the Residential Tenancies Act, and it's reflected by the nature of the AGI, or the above guideline increase, which is why you're allowed to, in fact, apply for an AGI, is because the tenants do pay that property tax. You just don't realize it because you're remitting the tax on behalf of the tenant the same way that retailers remit HST on behalf of their customers. The difference is that HST, we all understand it, and it's a separate line item. In rental housing, it's hidden, and it's deliberately hidden, in my opinion, by government, because it's, if they raise taxes, they don't want the tenants to scream about it. Better to let the landlords take the heat. But my point in mentioning that is in Oshawa, the property tax on a rental property, on a multi-unit residential rental property is literally double that of a single family home. So what you've got are the lowest wage income earners paying literally double the property tax of single family homeowners. And that's unconscionable. And in Durham, all 10 municipalities are in the top 20 worst offenders of that policy. There are 444 municipalities in Ontario, and all of Durham are in the top 20. So if you're now going to throw on top of that double tax, you're also now going to throw a licensing fee. You really are devastating the low income wage earners, and they don't even see that. Low equity and high cost slows down the local economy. I'm not going to get into that. You can just take my word for it, or we can talk about it offline. slow housing starts, and ever-increasing infrastructure costs. Infrastructure, I'm talking about police force, the fire department, roads, snow plowing, park maintenance, and all the things that garbage collection and so on. If you don't have the taxes to pay for those things, then those services start to suffer. And if you don't have enough people, which is the whole issue, the legislation was passed 15 years ago called the Places to Grow Act. And what it did was wrap green belts around 24 municipalities in Ontario and said, thou shalt not build here. What you have to do is increase the density of the number of people who are using the sewer systems and the roads and so on, so we can justify carrying these costs. And they refer to that as intensification or densification, to increase the density. And if you don't increase the density, then the taxes have to be spread over a lower number of people. And if you put in a program like this licensing, it will impact the density growth that the cities are looking for. So again, they're shooting themselves in the foot, because on the one hand, they want to increase density. On the other hand, they're going to throw in licensing that's going to discourage that density creation. I've already talked about the destruction of $110 million of property equity, and there's a little formula that I use to do that. Municipalities lack the understanding, or frankly dismiss, really how the creation and provision of residential housing really works. No one has ever called me, despite repeated attempts by myself to try and get them to understand, the mechanics of and the math behind running these businesses. So to your question, Vidal, I hope I got your first name right. Pardon me if I didn't. The city's real problem. Now, they wanted to go and license every single property, but when we started listening to all the questions, and it was a full day of questions from the councillors, they all revolved around single family homes that had what we call second suites. In other words, they put in a basement apartment or an attic apartment or an add-on to the back or a coach house, whatever. And they felt that the city, feel that that they're not getting the permits and that they're not meeting building code, fire code, and electrical code. And that's maybe half true, but there's also the whole issue of permits. They're not getting that revenue that they think they're entitled to. They won't say that, but money makes the world go round, and I'm sure that's on their minds as well. So the two issues that came up was the second suites and slumlords. And believe me, there are some real slumlords. And Vidal, you spoke to those as well in your own experiences. But there are also professional tenants, and we don't determine the character and the profile and make our decisions based on professional tenants and their bad behavior, let's call it. But all legislation assumes that all landlords are at their lowest common denominator, which are slumlords. And that to me is just fundamentally wrong. And that was another thing that really irked me about this process. By saying that they wanted to check every single property, they were effectively saying, we think you're all slumlords and we don't trust you. The process that we've got isn't good enough. So we're now going to watch you like, I don't know, prisoners in a prison. And I found that just, fundamentally wrong. There were no questions that arose around purpose-built properties. In fact, one of the councillors, when I was speaking, asked me what kind of properties I had, and I said I had, my smallest property was a sixplex, and that was the end of the questions. But she was focused a lot on other people who only owned duplexes, for example, in single-family homes. One of the councillors was also big on saying that there was a fire 2 years ago and 3 people died. It made it into the news big time because there was a meth lab on the ground floor. It caught fire. Nobody called the police department. There was only one exit out, and the people on the second floor died. Now, most people don't realize that those people on the second floor was a mother and 2 children. I think there was another person. I thought there was 4, but I know for sure there was a mother and 2 children. They died, but they didn't die from fire. They died from carbon monoxide poisoning. And they blamed the landlord. It's a complicated story. I've spoken with both sides on that, and I don't think the landlord was as culpable as the city wanted him to be. But the councillor said there was only one exit, and it wasn't to code, and they want to prevent that thing from happening again. So this whole concept of preventable deaths or avoidable deaths was another justification for the program. And I'm going to speak to these points. And then the last point was what makes the world go round. And one of the councillors who's very, very left-wing actually jumped out of his seat physically and said, there's no way taxpayers are going to pay for this program. So if taxpayers aren't paying, who is? And that's when they went back and said, okay, well, why don't you go and see if you can't do a full cost recovery, which is recent legislation. I think it's only a few years old, that the province gave to the municipality so that they could recover costs that they can't normally recover through property taxes. So I'm going to talk about these points. It was really interesting. I put this into a presentation that I sent to the city. I looked up the word bureaucrat, and wouldn't you know it, that it just zeroed in. And this is what I really liked. An official in a government department, particularly one who is perceived as being concerned with procedural correctness at the expense of people's needs. And while it's a dig and maybe even inflammatory, I just had to put it in there. I haven't heard back from any councillors yet in any point, in any case. So slumlords are not just a city problem. It reflects badly on all of us. And legislation already reflects that. They treat us as all of us as slumlords, but they treat tenants as a sort of a medium. Sure, there's some bad ones, there's some really good ones, and then there's your average. One of the questions I asked of the councillors offline was, what's driving this process? How many people have you actually prosecuted? And they said, well, it's a really expensive and time-consuming process to take slumlords to court. And I said, well, and that's something I reflected on. And in the proposal that I sent back to the city, I suggested that they start thinking outside the box. I know that's like asking a leopard to change its spots, I suppose. But I said, you really need to find some interagency cooperation if you want to solve housing. All the issues of housing, not just unaffordability, not just compliance issues, but all the types of challenges that arise. And you can't do it alone. You really got to reach out to the province. The province has to reach out to the feds, and all of them work together. And one of the things that they could do, there's an organization that's run by the Ministry of Housing, the LTB, Landlords to Blame, Loves Tenants Best, License to Butcher, or the Landlord and Tenant Bureau. They are run by the Ministry of the Attorney General. But the Ministry of Housing has a rental housing enforcement unit. There were 18 investigative officers there 4 years ago. I don't know how many are there now. In a presentation they did to our Landlord Association a couple of years ago, they said that they had about 25,000 complaints that they handled per year. 85% of them came from tenants, while 91% of those cases of LTB cases come from landlords. So think about that. 9 out of 10 cases that go to the LTB are from landlords. 75% of the cases from landlords are about non-payment of rent. So 75% of 91% is 66%. So 2/3 of all the applications that go to the LTB about non-payment of rent. With the RHAU, the bulk of those complaints are about illegal access. In other words, a landlord just going into a unit without the tenant's permission, without giving proper notice and so on, and turning off vital services. You didn't pay for the electricity or the water, so I'm turning it off. Well, if you don't know that you can't do that, you can't. And these are the kinds of issues that they deal with. And about 10% of all the cases that they prosecute, 10% of all the cases that they get are prosecuted at the LTB. So they, the RHAU, routinely go to the LTB to prosecute landlords. They never lose, or rarely ever lose. And I'm suggesting that the city should work with the RHAU and together go after these slumlords. It's good for us as landlords, it's good for the city, and it's good for the tenants. And that was one of the proposals that I made. Now, it may cost something. The ministry is going to say, well, we can't take on all of your issues, but whatever it costs, it's got to be a hell of a lot cheaper than $5 million a year. And I'm sure it's going to be a lot faster, and they've got the expertise at the RHAU to do these kinds of things, and they could actually teach the municipality. So I threw that out there as an option. Back in 20, yeah.
Chris, we have a question from Alex, and Alex asked, can introduction of licensing be a legal reason to cancel a lease?
I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to answer that question based on my personal experience, and I would say no. And the reason I would say no is because licensing is intended to comply with the minimum standards set by the building code, and the Residential Tenancies Act requires that every landlord and property owner is responsible for the maintenance and upkeep of the property, not the tenant. And you can, in fact, get in trouble if you put maintenance requirements into your lease, because they would be unenforceable because of the RTA. If you want a tenant to pay for maintenance and shovel the snow and take out their own garbage and cut their grass and so on, you have to hire them as a separate contractor under a separate agreement, not in the lease, because it's not enforceable in the lease. And that's the best answer I can give you on that question. So I'm going to move on. So I talked about a merit program, and the idea of the merit program was that instead of using a hammer and punitive fines, punishment for every infraction, why not seek out all the great landlords and recognize them by giving them a certificate that says, hey, we've never received a single complaint from you, or we only get one a year, or one, there's some criteria that qualifies what a good landlord is. And if they were to publish a certificate like that, and they gave that to me, that would be a tremendous marketing tool. I'd put that up in my foyer and say, here, the city thinks we're great. The tenants would might consider, landlords who have these certificates before they would consider. Or right now, I don't think that's an issue because they can't find rental units anywhere. But in a more equalized environment, having that certificate would be a positive reinforcement of your credibility as a landlord operating in the city. But one of the real tangible benefits that I would see for landlords to participate in this is because if you've got a certificate like that, it's much harder for a tenant to take advantage of a bylaw officer and use them to further use bylaw officers to further the tenant's own agenda. And I've had that happen to me several times. I'd say something to the tenant like, why don't you recycle your garbage? So they go and find some infraction. Instead of dealing with the issue, they'll call up a bylaw officer and say, hey, I'm missing my screen window. And the bylaw officer won't care less about why the tenant called, what their real motivations are. They will just focus on the issue. And if you bring up their issue about the tenant, they say, sorry, we don't prosecute tenants. And again, I'm being a little bit overly inflammatory, but I've met a few bylaw officers that are really reasonable, I guess would be the best word. But I've met far more that are just militant, and obnoxious, power mad, frankly. There's no consistency in my experience, and I've worked in multiple cities. So, I can speak with some insight and authority on that. In any event, I sent this merit program back in 2017. They ignored it. I sent it to the head of the commissioner for corporate services, which is the same lady who is the head of the bylaw department and other services today in Oshawa. She's the one that would implement this program. And she knew about my feedback 2 years ago, and still they ignored it. I've actually appended it. So what page are we on here? I'm sorry, I'm only on page, well, whatever it is. But at the very bottom of my presentation, I actually have the whole email trail, Tracy Adams. I'll be in touch next week. Thank you for this, that, and the other. She sent me back a 54-page document about what they were doing. And I said, hey, the word award, certificate, reward, incentive, none of those words were in this 54-page document. And I never received a reply to that either. So slumlords, merit program, education. I would argue that 85% of all of the conflict that arises between a tenant and a landlord is about money. And I would put that down into two main categories. As far as I'm concerned, if you take all the issues you can think about, especially when you're qualifying a tenant, I would say that you want two things. Now you might have 20. I have 22 bullets on my qualification list, but it really boils down to two things. I want the tenant to pay the full rent when it's due by the method that we've agreed to. And for me, it's online interact services is what I prefer. And I want the tenant to respect the property and their neighbors. And if you take all of the things that you can think about that cause you grief, it probably falls into one of those two categories. And both of those are about money. Someone flushed something down the toilet's plugged. Please unplug it. Okay, that'll cost you $250. No, that's your job. You're responsible for maintenance. This is not a maintenance issue. This is a property damage issue. Oh yeah, what are you going to do about it? And that's probably a summary of a very common conversation. If it's not about a toilet or a fridge or a stove or a leaky water pipe or whatever, they all have a common denominator of story. And I suggested that if it's really about the money, and I genuinely believe it is, then why not educate landlords so that they can understand that there are things that they can do to the property that actually will benefit them rather than drive the property into the ground. And I'll give you a very simple example. When I bought a property, my first property in 2011, so that's 11 11 years ago, all the tenants had electricity included in the rent. In the first year, I went and suite metered them. So I installed a separate meter for every one of the units. And as the tenants moved out, I can't get the tenants to pay electricity, suddenly. They wouldn't do that. But as they moved out and the new tenants moved in, they paid their own electricity. When I first bought that property, my electricity costs were $15,000 a year. By the end of the fourth year, I'd reduced that to $5,000 a year. 11 out of my 12 tenants were now paying their own electricity. In fact, I had an almost 100% turnover in my tenants in 4 years, which is unusual. Certainly not the way it is now, but it was then. The reason I mention that is that $10,000 savings went into my pocket, and you say, well, that's pretty damn good. How much did it cost for the meters? Cost me about $12,000. So in a year and a quarter, I got my money back. But that's not where the compelling aspect of this investment is. The compelling aspect goes back to this relationship that I talked to you about before regarding NOI. For every $1 that you can increase your net operating income without an associated expense, in other words, it's one true dollar of profit, you increase the value of your property by $20. So the way to remember that is $1 of NOI is $20 of joy, or $20 of oi if it's bad. In other words, if they add a fee for licensing and it costs me, say, $500 a year for that license, then they've knocked off 20 times that $500, which is 10 grand. They've reduced the value of my property, my investment property, by $20,000 because of their $500 increase. So that $10,000 I saved in electricity is a $200,000 increase in my property value. And you say, well, that's fantastic, but I'm never going to see that money until I sell. No, that's not true. When you refinance 5 years from now and your mortgage comes due for renewal, instead of your property being worth $800,000, it's now worth $1 million. So you'll be able to extract that money and use it for other things. And that's where the true power of real estate really comes in, is this relationship between NOI and property value. So if you could get the city to take on an education program that explained that to landlords, then it becomes brain dead easy to justify a $9,000 expense to replace a 20-year-old boiler with a brand new boiler, because you're going to save money on gas consumption. And new boilers versus 20-year-old boilers save anywhere from 30 to 50%. So if you got a $3,000 gas bill and you invest $9,000 to put in a new boiler, then, and you save 50% of $3,000 is $1,500. 1,500 into 9 grand is what? 6 years. So I would get in 6 years, I would get my money back, and then I would have an extra $1,500 in my pocket every year. But more importantly, that $1,500 is $30,000 I've increased the equity. Would you spend $9,000, which you would get back within 6 years, so you can increase the value of your property by $30,000? I do. I've done it for every one of my properties. And that's just one example, and there's lots of them. So they could educate on this concept of direct capitalization method. That's what I'm talking about. The $1 of NOI is $20 of joy, right? Educate them, get them to understand that. And I can think of 30 different things you could do to your property that would improve property standards by the inherent nature of the upgrade. You didn't do it because you want to increase property standard. You did it because you want to increase affordability of your property. But the tenants get that benefit, and the city gets what they're looking for. So this is another thing that they could do. They have a newsletter that they put out, the first one. They say it's going to be quarterly, and it's from their economic development department. Every city has one, an ED. And what they're trying to do is attract investors to the city and say, this is the place where you would want to grow your business. Well, that's all great. And if Oshawa does, in fact, it has attracted a lot of high-tech companies to the city, which brings all kinds of jobs and better quality of life and improves the local economy and all those kinds of things. But if you don't have housing for those people, then how did you win? How can you possibly attract that business if you don't have the housing to put those people in it, to put people into? And I told them that. I said, it's a very sandy. Think about it. Trying to build a house on sand, where the foundation keeps on moving all the time, the houses are going to collapse. And I threw that out there, and I said, you can do all you want to try and attract investors and promise a return on investment and a better quality of life, success, and all that kind of stuff. But you're never going to attract them if you don't have the housing for it. So I threw that out there, and in fact, they heard that firsthand. A number of investor groups in the April 4th meeting said we're not, we're looking elsewhere than Oshawa because of it. So this is something that if you guys ever get faced with it, with your own city, you want to throw that at them and say, have you really thought about this? And I suggested that in that ED newsletter, or create a separate one just for landlords to talk about the things that they could do and how things could be better and how you can improve relations, et cetera, et cetera. But if that's too much work, at least put in some positive reinforcing articles into the ED newsletter. I think they would get a lot of traction out of that. The issue of mixed messages, which is what that was, on the one hand, come and invest. Oh, by the way, if you invest, we're going to license the hell out of you and extract $5 million and look over your shoulder with our, enhanced police state. Not a week, well, maybe a week, but certainly 2 or 3 times a month, not, at least 2 or 3 times a month, I get a phone call from some social housing agency, whether it's a mosque or a synagogue or a church, or one of the disease centers or ODSP. There's a lot of them out there, and they're all trying to convince me to rent my property to them. And every time I will spend half an hour to an hour and explain to them the issues that I have as a landlord and what they're not doing to satisfy my concerns. So consequently, very little happens. And that's why I say they're struggling, mostly unsuccessfully, to engage the private sector to help them with their charges. We're just not equipped to deal with mental health issues and hoarding and people who have disabilities. We're not trained for that. In fact, we're not trained, period, which is perhaps an issue in itself. But we're certainly not, it's one thing to be able to rationalize with someone who can carry on an intelligent conversation and say, well, is that fair? Do you think that's fair? If the shoes were reversed, would you, still behave this way? But you can't do that with somebody who doesn't think, with the same value system or with the same thought processes. So the bottom line is you wind up with the same rent and a hell of a lot more baggage. That's really the bottom line. And the human rights people say, well, you can't do that. But as long as I'm getting 200 inquiries every time I have a vacancy, and I'm getting between 6 and 10 applications every time I have a vacancy, I'm always going to be able to choose. And unhappily, the 4S, I came up with this phrase called the 4S vulnerable groups. And if you think about all the different types of people that are at high risk of not getting housing, I broke it down into seniors, single moms, students, and social assistants, which includes refugees. Immigrants are not a vulnerable group. They're usually quite affluent. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been successful in getting an immigration status. They all share common vulnerability denominators, and basically, all these groups have the same problem. They don't have any work history, they don't have any rental history, and/or they don't have any income history. And these, any one of these things, 3 can be a disqualifier. And if it's 2 or more, they don't usually even make it onto a consideration list. And how were these guys created? Well, let's go back to my $1 of noise, $20 of joy. We'll take seniors. In a perfect world where there was no rent control, I would only rent to seniors. They are by far the most pleasant, easygoing, accommodating, and manageable group of all the demographic groups that you can think of. But they're fatally flawed. And the fatal flaw is the same as it is with social assistance. Once they move in, they won't move out. So if the tenant a senior moves in today and they're paying $1,000 a month, I'm going to keep the number simple, for the math calculation. They're paying $1,000 a month for one bedroom, and 10 years from now, they're still there, and they're paying $1,200 a month for one bedroom. While the market is at $1,500 because all the costs have gone up. That $300 difference might not seem like a lot, and you say, okay, well, that's my responsibility to society. Seniors have worked all their lives. They're entitled to some discount. And you would say, okay, $300, it's not what I want, but it's not too bad. Now, that's $300 a month times 12 is $3,600 a year. Now it's starting to hurt. But at a 5% cap rate, that is 20 times that. So that $3,600 is $72,000 of lost equity forever. You will never get that until that tenant moves out and you adjust the rent. And if you've got a building, a 10-unit building filled with 10 seniors who have been there for 10 years, that's $750,000 that you will never see. Why would you want to invest in a property where you will never be able to get the equity out of that property? So seniors are fatally flawed as an investment group, and social assistance for the same reason. Once they're in there, they're only making $800 a month from the government and maybe a little bit extra. They're trapped. And you know that today. They can't move, even if they wanted to. Even if they got a better job, they couldn't move because, what they're paying for $800 probably cost them $1,500 anywhere else. And you could never get a job where you can increase your income by 50% so you can cover off that increase in the in your housing costs. So the low end wage earners and the fixed income earners are all trapped because of rent control. And the government doesn't see it, or if they do, they're unwilling to acknowledge it because too many people think rent control is really good for tenants, and it's not. And this is one of the reasons. So when I talk about made vulnerable by failed housing policies and legislation, rent control is one example of several that have created those people. The other thing is, I was just watching a program today on TVO about the financialization of housing, and there was a left-wingist extremely, saying, you can't do this, and the greedy landlords that, and it's got to stop, and we have a right to housing and all that kind of stuff. And the host finally said, well, you've told us all the things you can't do. What can you do? What should we do? And she stumbled. I don't think anybody ever bothered to ask her that question, and she wasn't really ready for the answer. And her only answer was, well, the government should build more housing. Well, let me tell you this about that. It ain't ever going to happen. And the reason it's not going to happen is because 98.5% of all the housing that was ever built in Canada was built by us, by the private sector, not by the public sector. 1.5%. There's about 14.5 million private residential homes and units in the country, and there's about 220,000 public sector homes. You divide the two of them together, and this is the number that comes out. On top of that, Ontario, I'm talking about the province of Ontario, which is just one of the provinces in Canada, has the 10th largest debt in the world. There are 168 countries that have that have a smaller debt than our province. We have a $401 billion debt, and Russia has a lower debt than we do. So if you think that the province is going to come up with any kind of money to solve the housing crisis, forget it. The federal government said they're going to spend $40 billion. When you run the numbers, $40 billion for housing works out to 18,900 homes. Ontario needs 650,000 homes just to get to match the lowest housing per capita in the country. Ontario has the lowest in the whole country. And in order to just break even, we need 650,000. And the federal government is saying, hey, we're going to build 20,000. Yeah, so. And then they announced that they're going to make it 72. So let's call it 80. All right, so now you're going to have 40,000 homes. So now we only need what? 600,000 for Ontario. What about the rest of the country? The government will never, ever solve housing availability. They can only do it with us, and they can only do it if we do it on a voluntary basis. Right? You can't force someone to invest. And if they have to, and I know that firsthand, I know people who are investing in Florida, in Texas, and in Ohio, of all places. I know one lady who owns 12 houses, and she drives to Ohio once a month. It's an 8-hour drive. Houses there, when she was buying them, were about 300,000, and she was getting almost the same rent, a few $100 less than what we get. And she owned 12 houses, and she'd go there, and you can get an eviction in less than 2 months. So there are other places to invest other than Ontario or Oshawa. Putting in a licensing program, I know I've gone off track a little bit, but I wanted to give you a sense of the scale that these bureaucrats have no concept of. They will never, ever solve the problem. Putting in licensing was only going to exacerbate not only the relationship between landlords and government, but between landlords and the social housing community. Why would we want to take on all of that extra burden when we've got enough to deal with the people who can actually afford, maybe that's harsh, people who are carrying own 2 cars and have 2 kids and they're upwardly mobile, and we used to call them young urban professionals, yuppies. I don't know if that's even still in fashion. I suggested also that the municipality set up a housing committee. I came up with a definition. Housing is the foundation of sustainable living, without which any society cannot survive or develop, and a lack of housing is a catalyst to myriad social ills. And what I mean by that is when there's a shortage of housing, you're going to see a directly inverse relationship between a shortage of housing and an increase not only in homelessness, but in crime. Because there's no stability. Without a home and stability, crime rises. And the more affluent are targeted because of it. And we're seeing that now. So I suggested that they establish a housing committee that has at least one city councillor, the bylaw manager, or somebody above them. In our case, housing is not mandated by the municipalities. In fact, they're not allowed to be in affordable housing. It's the Durham region that's responsible for housing. So you'd want somebody from the region in our case. And I don't know, in your case, if you'd have a county representative, for example, that might be there. Pardon me. But importantly, there should be 3 different reps. And this is the issue that all of us in this meeting today face. Nobody understands that the small rental property owners have a completely different set of problems from the large guys. And one of 100 examples, you may not be aware, but if you have 5 or more employees, your tax rate, you're considered to be an active income business. So your tax rate is 13%. But because we've got less than 5 employees, it's considered passive, even though we all work every day of the week, 7 days a week, 365 a year most times. It's still considered a passive investment, the same as if you invested in bonds or stocks, where you don't have to do anything, you just let it sit there and wait for the money to come in. And we pay a 50% corporate tax rate. That's a completely different problem from the big guys. And it's a completely different problem from builders. So we really need to have 3 different representatives for these 3 different demographic groups within the housing provider industry. Mentioned before that almost half, and when I say unincorporated, I mean people are holding the properties in their own personal names, which is not a good idea, because if you ever get sued by a tenant, they can take your home. they can take everything that you own. And you might want to think twice about owning a property in your personal name. The problem that I had when I first got started was my accountant said, well, no, you're going to pay more tax. And the lawyer said, well, yeah, you're going to pay more tax, but you'll lose everything if you have one calamitous event like that fire. And you have absolutely no control over not only whether or not the tenant starts a fire, but whether or not 3 people die in your home. So, you know, that's something else that you might want to think about. This committee could talk about, you know, address the issues of slumlords and non-compliance, the merit program, all the things that I talked about before. Now, here's another out-of-the-box idea. Why can't we have a damage deposit? Without the damage deposit, we currently are at the mercy of tenants. They basically can do what they like. They can damage the property, and we have no practical recourse. Yeah, there's legal recourse, but if we can't get an eviction for 10 months and we can't get AGI for 3 years, what do you think the chances are that we're going to get any money recovered? And even if we did get awarded the damages at the LTB, there is no method by which you can collect. Now, if you have a parking fine and you don't pay that parking fine, you don't get your driver's license. So the government figured that one out pretty easy. And if you have alimony to pay and you don't pay that alimony, you're going to jail, potentially. It depends. I mean, it's a civil matter, so I don't know if there's actual jail time. But they track it, and they will, there's contempt of court aspects. I really don't know that part of legislation at all. It's just what I've read cursorily. But I know that there's recourse for the collection of alimony. Yet we cannot get that for damage deposits. And I'm saying, all right, well, maybe the happy middle is, why doesn't the province empower the municipalities to be the arbiters, or, you know, to manage the process of damage deposits? And that could be part of bylaw compliance. And you would say, well, wait a minute, the last thing I want is the municipality to get involved in that kind of stuff. And the difference here is that I'm talking about a voluntary damage deposit. You might want to do it, you might not as a landlord, but at least give me the choice. So if you have a damage deposit and some slumlord says, well, I'm not giving you the money back, then the municipality could say, all right, well, we're going to, you know, we're going to prosecute you under the legislation that's, you know, been given to us by the province. And we're charging you double. And if you still don't pay it, we'll put it on your property taxes. And if you still don't pay it, we'll put a lien on your property so you can never sell it. Now that might give them more power, but at least it allows us to get the, to decide whether or not we want a damage deposit. And the onus would be put on us as landlords to defend our position. So if we take pictures of the unit before the tenant moves in, and take a video, and then get them to sign off, and then we compare what was then to what it was like when they moved out, and we have an agreement of what we would consider to be damage versus wear and tear, then I think we should be allowed to ask for that damage deposit. The other issue that arises, so, you know, you put the onus on the landlord to prove that they're entitled to keep some of that deposit. And if you prove it reasonably, then you get to keep it. And, you know, we've got some, you know, method for curtailing bad tenant behavior or misbehavior in this case. Learn from other countries. Switzerland has an excellent process for dealing with housing. It's very well balanced. I know I was there a couple of years ago, and I actually looked into this with somebody that owned a couple of properties. And it's a little bit authoritarian, you know, like thou shalt do, but it's on both sides. The tenant thou shalt and the landlord thou shalt. And I'd much rather have that, as long as it's balanced, than to have what we've got currently, which is a free-for-all and no recourse. The other issue that I know the left wingers, the left, I don't know, whatever you want to call them, libertarians, or liberals, not libertarians, would bring up is that damage deposits can be a huge barrier, and it further broadens the gap between the haves and have-nots. While there's all kinds of other solutions that are out there that have been made available to deal with exactly this issue. So that is no longer a valid argument. And I won't get into it here because we're getting behind the time, and I'm maybe only halfway through. Robert, you have to tell me when I'm running out of time, and I might have to move forward a little more quickly.
Hey, Chris, no problem. I just normally we try to wrap up the call around 8:30, but perhaps what we could do here is have you go to 8:30
Okay.
and then pause for questions.
All right.
And then we could kind of gauge the group if they wanted to stay on longer. It's hard to tell. It's hard to tell. Sometimes people are willing to carry on longer, and sometimes they have to go.
Okay. So let me just see how many pages I've got here. I think I've got, I've got 13 pages, and I'm on page 10. So I won't get there in 10 minutes, but what I'll do is I'll just skip through a couple of these things quickly then. With the 10 minutes I've got.
You're getting close.
Sorry, go ahead.
You're getting close.
Okay.
That's not bad.
Yeah, it's not too bad. It might be 20 minutes, but one of the people in the presentation said, look, even if you got your licensing program, the reality is that landlords have no control. We have to give 24 hours written notice, and I'm not about to do that unless I absolutely have to, and I'm going to drag my feet any chance I get. But even if I did do all that and reluctantly complied with your state-sanctioned surveillance program, the reality is that the tenant can say, no, I don't want you to come in. I don't want you to come in and do inspections. Now they might, but it has to be at their convenience, which means in the evening. So all these bylaw officers going to work nights, work night shifts. I don't know, that they're going to do that. I think there's all kinds of inherent productivity inefficiencies, and I won't get into the legislation here because I'm running short on time. But if you want me to come back to it, just say so. All right. The bottom line is bylaw officers and police officers have no right to enter a property without a warrant. Fire inspectors actually have that right, but they don't do it, or rarely do it. They'll only do it if they feel that there's a significant issue or potential life-threatening situation. They respect privacy, and this program flies counter to that whole premise of of privacy and the right to quiet enjoyment. There is an existing process already in place. It's been around for decades, with the bylaw people. It's not perfect, but if you have reactive monitoring that is driven by complaints, in other words, the tenant has complained or a landlord has complained, that's the way we've always done things. And we work by exception. That's what that's really all about. What these guys want to do is say, we're going to monitor everything, and then we'll find out who the really bad guys are, right? A bit of that George Orwellian 1984 Big Brother, watching thing. But if you look at reactive monitoring enforcement, it's egalitarian. That means it's equal rights for all and democratic. And it's driven by a complaints process, and it seeks to address specific real-world issues as they arise. What these guys are suggesting is a proactive monitoring enforcement system, which I would consider to be totalitarian and autocratic. It's driven by the government's imposed view of a moral compass. We'll decide what's good for you. Yet throughout the world, the worst slumlords of all are government projects. Some of the worst, not all of them, but most of them devolve into really, so I find it incredibly hypocritical that a government that can't manage their own housing program would tell us how to do it. And, if you think I'm being too inflammatory, then think of it as government overreach. So I'll let that go. Preventable deaths. Most people don't realize, I didn't even know it, but if you take out medical issues like cancer and heart disease and so on, and you look at the rest, which are preventable deaths, the number one preventable death is higher than motor vehicles is accidental poisoning. Now, that's not necessarily just about a baby drinking some Drano by mistake. It could also be a fentanyl overdose. I never did get a number for what accidental poisoning means, but I think overdoses would be a large part of that. But still, it's a hell of a lot bigger problem than people who are dying because of a non-compliant rental unit. And this is one of the things I sent to the city as well. Suicide, falls, motor vehicles, obesity, smoking. These are all preventable deaths. And yet they want to license us because ... There are about 7,000 people on the Durham's waiting list, which can take anywhere from 7 to 10 years to get into affordable housing or subsidized housing. In Ontario, it's about 500,000 people or 175,000 families. How many of those people might die or become homeless before we find housing for them? That to me is a higher priority than compliant single family homes and slumlords. Homelessness, in my opinion, and it may be callous, but as far as I'm concerned, any housing is better than no housing. And if you took, and I have, this is why I know, you take a survival course, you'll be taught that your first order of business is to find shelter before you look for water. It's the rule of threes. You've got 3 minutes in a very hazardous environment to find shelter, either extreme heat or extreme cold. You've got 3 days without water, and you got 3 weeks without food. If you don't do it within that time period, you're dead. Now, that's a very rough rule. You know, some people are, you know, can last longer, and there's all kinds of exceptions, but that's a general rule of thumb. In summary, it's always easier to impose than to cooperate. And that's what this city is doing. It's hard work to get buy-in, to do things, to get compliancy, to get landlords and tenants on the same page. It's a lot easier to say, do it my way, or I'll hit you with a hammer. Democracies are built on cooperation, though, and they're far more prosperous and they're far more affluent than autocracies, which are built on the visions of one person or an elite group. Think about all the countries where there's one person that runs it and how affluent that country is versus the democracies. And I think that you would find that this generally holds to be true. And what the city is doing with their licensing is going into that second class of autocracy. Do it my way because we know better than you do how things should be done. Part of a counselor's role is to determine how best to use the limited resources that municipalities have to do the most good. That's their job. And I would argue that licensing is far from meeting that criterion. And lastly, there's a long list of higher priorities. There's a plethora of potentially negative, foreseeable, and unforeseeable consequences from licensing. Why would you do it? And that's my presentation. If you want a copy of this presentation, just send me an email and I'll send you a PDF.